12-year-old Marcus sat nervously in the waiting area of the airport, gripping his small backpack. This was his first time flying alone, and even though his mother had explained everything, he still felt a little scared. He was going to visit his grandmother, who had been sick for weeks. She always told him stories over the phone. But now he would finally get to see her again. Marcus had his ticket in hand, double-checking it every few minutes. His mother had reminded him again and again to keep it safe. "Don't lose it, okay?" she had said, kissing his forehead before he left for the airport. He wouldn't. He knew how important this trip was. When the announcement came that his flight was boarding, Marcus stood up quickly, following the other passengers in line. He handed his ticket to the flight attendant at the gate, a kind-looking man who smiled at him and nodded. "You're good to go, buddy. Have a safe flight," he said. Marcus walked down the narrow jet bridge, feeling his heart beat faster. He stepped onto the plane, looking around in awe. It was bigger than he expected, with rows of seats stretching far back. He found his seat near the window and carefully placed his backpack in front of him. He couldn't wait to see the clouds from up high. As Marcus settled in, a tall flight attendant with sharp eyes and a stiff posture walked past him. She glanced at him but didn't say anything at first. Marcus tried not to pay attention. He just wanted to enjoy the flight. But a few minutes later, she returned and stood next to his seat. "Excuse me, young man," she said in a firm voice. "Can I see your ticket?" Marcus quickly pulled out his ticket from his pocket and handed it to her. She looked at it, then frowned. "This ticket isn't valid," she said. Marcus blinked in confusion. But I just gave it to the man at the gate, and he said it was okay," he replied softly. She shook her head. "There must be a mistake. You need to come with me." Marcus felt his face grow hot. Other passengers started looking in his direction. He didn't understand. His mother had bought the ticket, checked everything, made sure he had what he needed. How could it not be valid? I don't think there's a mistake," he said, his voice shaking. "This is my flight. My mom bought this ticket." The flight attendant's expression didn't change. She gave him a hard look and called another crew member over. "We have a situation here," she said. "This boy is sitting in a seat he doesn't belong in." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't trying to cause trouble. He just wanted to see his grandmother. A few moments later, an airport security officer arrived. He was tall, wearing a dark uniform, and looked serious. "Sir, please escort this passenger off the plane," the flight attendant instructed. Marcus's heart pounded. "But I didn't do anything wrong," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The officer sighed. "Come on, son. Let's step out and figure this out." Marcus felt the weight of every passenger's eyes on him as he stood up, grabbing his backpack. His hands trembled as he walked past rows of people, his legs heavy like they were filled with stone. No one said a word. Some just looked down, avoiding his gaze. As he stepped off the plane and back into the jet bridge, he could feel the sting of tears in his eyes. He didn't understand why this was happening. He had done everything right. His mom had told him he would be fine. So why was he being forced off the plane? Outside, he stood in the terminal, confused and scared. The plane's door shut behind him. His seat was gone. His trip was gone. And worst of all, he had no idea what to do next. Marcus stood near the gate, his backpack hanging from his shoulders. His hands gripped the straps tightly, trying to stop them from shaking. He felt lost, confused, and embarrassed. The flight attendant had kicked him off the plane, and now he was alone in the busy terminal. Passengers walked past him, some glancing his way, but no one stopped to help. He kept replaying the moment in his head. He had done everything right. His mother had bought the ticket. The man at the gate had let him through. So why did that flight attendant say his ticket wasn't valid? It didn't make sense. Marcus wiped his eyes quickly and took a deep breath. His mother had always told him to stay calm and think clearly when things went wrong. But right now, nothing felt right. He wanted to call her, but he was afraid she'd worry too much. She had trusted the airline to take care of him. How could he tell her that they had forced him off the plane? A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Hey, kid, are you okay?" Marcus turned to see a tall man in an airline uniform. He had kind eyes and a gentle voice. His name tag read Mr. Ellis. Marcus hesitated before nodding, but Mr. Ellis could see the fear on his face. "Come on, son, let's sit down for a minute," he said, leading Marcus to a nearby bench. "Can you tell me what happened?" Mr. Ellis asked, kneeling so he was at eye level with Marcus. Marcus swallowed hard. "I was on my flight, and the flight attendant said my ticket wasn't good, but I know it was. The man at the gate checked it, and he said everything was fine." Mr. Ellis frowned. "That doesn't sound right." He reached for a small tablet he carried and asked, "Can I see your ticket?" Marcus quickly pulled it from his pocket and handed it over. Mr. Ellis typed in the information and waited for the system to load. His eyes widened slightly as he read the details. "This ticket is completely valid," he said, shaking his head. "You were supposed to be on that flight." Marcus felt both relief and frustration. He had been right all along. But if his ticket was good, why did they take him off the plane? Mr. Ellis sighed and looked toward the gate. "Stay here for a moment," he said. He walked over to the counter, speaking to another employee in a low voice. Marcus couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see the concerned expression on the worker's face. Meanwhile, back on the plane, the flight attendant, Miss Carter, was speaking to another passenger. "These kids try to sneak onto flights all the time," she said, shaking her head. "I had to remove him." A woman sitting nearby frowned. "I saw him show his ticket," she said. "He didn't look like he was sneaking onto anything." Miss Carter gave her a sharp look but didn't say anything else. She turned and continued preparing for takeoff, unaware that a storm was brewing outside the plane. At the gate, Mr. Ellis returned to Marcus with a serious expression. "Listen, kid," he said, kneeling again. "This was a mistake. You were never supposed to be removed. I don't know why that flight attendant did that, but I'm going to fix this." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "But the plane already left," he whispered. Mr. Ellis nodded. "I know, but don't worry. I'll get you on another flight as soon as possible." Just then, a woman sitting a few seats away stood up and walked toward them. She had short, curly hair and held a phone in her hand. "I saw what happened," she said to Mr. Ellis. "I recorded the whole thing." Marcus looked up at her in surprise. "People need to see this," the woman continued. "That boy didn't do anything wrong." Mr. Ellis took a deep breath. "You may be right," he said. Marcus didn't fully understand what was happening yet, but something told him that things were about to change. And this time, they would change in his favor. As Marcus sat on the bench, trying to make sense of everything that had happened, the woman with the phone stood nearby, waiting. She seemed calm, but there was something about the way she looked at him that made Marcus feel a little better. She wasn't looking at him with pity or judgment. She just seemed like she understood what he was going through. After a moment, the woman walked over to him and smiled gently. "Hey, I just wanted to let you know that I recorded everything," she said. Her voice was kind, but firm. "I was sitting near you when that flight attendant kicked you off the plane. I filmed the whole thing." Marcus blinked, not sure what to say. "You did?" he asked, his voice a little shaky. She nodded. "Yeah. I didn't think it was right, the way they treated you. I'm going to post the video online. People need to see this." Marcus didn't know what to think. A part of him felt grateful, but another part of him was scared. What would happen if the video got out? Would it make everything worse? Before he could say anything, Mr. Ellis returned with some news. "I've arranged for you to get on the next flight to your destination," he said, giving Marcus a reassuring smile. "But I want to make sure everything is right before we do that. I'm going to look into what happened with your ticket." Marcus nodded, feeling a little more at ease. He still didn't understand why the flight attendant had kicked him off the plane, but maybe things would be okay now. He had people trying to help him. As Mr. Ellis walked away, the woman with the phone introduced herself. "My name is Lisa," she said, extending her hand. Marcus took it, feeling a little better. "Marcus," he replied. "Thank you for recording what happened. I didn't know what to do." Lisa smiled. "No one should have to go through something like that, especially not a kid. I'm just glad I was there to see it and help." Marcus couldn't believe how kind she was. He had been so focused on his own confusion and fear that he hadn't even thought about how others might see what had happened. But now he realized how important it was that someone had taken the time to record the situation. "I'm going to post it online," Lisa said. "I'm sure people will want to help you out. There's no reason for something like this to happen." Marcus didn't fully understand how things worked with social media, but he had seen his older cousin post videos on Instagram before. He knew that the video Lisa had taken could spread quickly. What if a lot of people saw it? What would they say? Before he could think too much about it, the video was uploaded. Within minutes, it started to get attention. The comment section filled with messages of support for Marcus, and many people were outraged by what they had seen. The video spread across platforms, from Facebook to Twitter, with people sharing it, tagging the airline, and demanding answers. At the airport, the phone rang. Mr. Ellis answered it, looking concerned. The more he listened, the more his expression grew serious. He looked up at Marcus and Lisa, his face tight with frustration. "The airline is being flooded with messages about the video," he said, shaking his head. Marcus felt a little overwhelmed. What did all this mean? Why was everyone so upset about what happened to him? Lisa put a hand on his shoulder. "It's a good thing. People care. They'll make sure you get the justice you deserve." Marcus wasn't sure what justice meant, but he hoped it meant he could get back on the plane. He hadn't even thought about it before, but now he realized how important this trip was to him. It wasn't just about seeing his grandmother. It was about proving that he hadn't done anything wrong. The video was already making waves, but Marcus couldn't help wondering what would happen next. Would the airline fix things? Would they apologize? He had no way of knowing yet, but the wheels were already in motion, and Marcus was beginning to feel like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. As Marcus waited with Lisa, he could hear the quiet hum of the airport around him. It felt like the world had slowed down, but at the same time, everything was moving too fast. He couldn't stop thinking about the flight attendant, and what had just happened to him. He had been kicked off the plane for no reason, and now it felt like his whole trip was in jeopardy. But as the minutes passed, he began to notice something changing in the air. People who had seen the video online started showing up at the airport. Some were just ordinary passengers, but others were reporters, and a few had cameras. They all seemed to know about the video, and they were all asking questions. Lisa had stepped away to speak to someone, and Marcus found himself surrounded by people who wanted to know more. One reporter approached him, holding a microphone. "Hi, Marcus," she said, her voice calm and friendly. "We've seen the video. Can you tell us how you're feeling about everything that happened?" Marcus froze for a moment, unsure of how to answer. The idea of talking to reporters had never crossed his mind. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, but somehow he found himself nodding slowly. I didn't do anything wrong," he said quietly, his voice shaking a little. "I had my ticket. I just wanted to go see my grandmother. I didn't understand why they made me leave the plane." The reporter smiled gently. "I'm really sorry this happened to you. You're not the only one who's been treated like this. People are really upset, and they want to make sure you're okay." The more Marcus spoke, the more he realized how many people cared about what had happened to him. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. The video was more than just a story about one boy being removed from a flight. It was a reminder that sometimes things just weren't right, and that people needed to stand up for what was fair. While Marcus spoke to reporters, Mr. Ellis returned with some news. His face was serious, but there was a glint of hope in his eyes. "I've spoken to the airline's management," he said, his voice firm. They're aware of the situation, and they're investigating what happened. They're going to make it right. Marcus felt a little lighter. At least someone was listening. But the news wasn't over yet. As Mr. Ellis spoke, the airline's public relations team began to arrive. They were there to handle the situation, and it was clear that they were taking it seriously. "We're very sorry this happened to you, Marcus," one of the PR team members said, offering a friendly smile. "The company will be looking into it and making sure that this kind of mistake doesn't happen again. We want to make it up to you." Marcus was surprised to hear that. It wasn't something he had expected. Just a few hours ago, he had been kicked off the plane, but now it seemed like people were actually trying to make it right. "I just want to go see my grandmother," Marcus said, his voice small. "We understand," the PR team member said, "and we'll make sure you get on a flight as soon as possible. We're also going to offer you a voucher for your troubles." It wasn't much compared to what he had gone through, but it was something. Marcus felt a little less anxious about the situation. Maybe, just maybe, everything would work out after all. As Mr. Ellis walked away to finalize the details, Lisa returned to Marcus's side. She had a proud smile on her face. "See, people are listening. You're not alone in this." Marcus looked around, realizing she was right. People were rallying behind him. What started as a single video had turned into something much bigger, a movement of people who wanted fairness, who wanted change. Marcus still didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to give up on seeing his grandmother, and with the support of so many people behind him, he felt more hopeful than he had in hours. It only took 7 minutes for things to start changing. What seemed like a small mistake, the removal of a young boy from a plane, had quickly turned into a national conversation. The video Lisa had posted online was now spreading everywhere. People from all over were watching, commenting, and sharing their thoughts. They couldn't believe how unfairly Marcus had been treated, and they were demanding answers. Back at the airport, Marcus could hardly keep up with everything happening around him. Reporters were asking questions, airport employees were running back and forth, and even passengers who had seen the video were beginning to voice their support. The atmosphere in the terminal was charged with energy, and Marcus, who had felt so alone just hours earlier, now found himself at the center of something much bigger than himself. Then something happened that he hadn't expected. Just as Mr. Ellis was finishing his conversation with the airline management, an official-looking woman in a suit approached. She introduced herself as the airline's customer relations manager, and her tone was serious. "Marcus, we've been made aware of the situation," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We deeply regret what you've gone through, and we are taking immediate action to ensure this is addressed." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. Was this really happening? Just a few hours ago, he had been on the outside, confused and scared. But now it seemed like everything was being set right. "I'm going to make sure you're booked on the next flight to see your grandmother," the customer relations manager continued. "And we will be providing a full investigation into what occurred today. The flight attendant involved will be reviewed for her actions." The words hit Marcus like a wave. He wasn't sure exactly what was going to happen, but it felt like things were finally taking the right direction. The company, which had seemed so distant and uncaring just hours ago, was now showing that they were willing to make things right. Before Marcus could respond, Mr. Ellis stepped forward. "There's more," he said. "The airline is also offering you a travel voucher for the inconvenience. We want to ensure you're treated with the respect you deserve." Marcus blinked, not fully processing everything that was happening. He was grateful, of course. But more than anything, he just wanted to be on the plane and to see his grandmother. The idea of the travel voucher didn't mean much compared to the moment he had lost, but he knew it was a step in the right direction. As the airline staff worked to make arrangements, something even bigger began to unfold. The video, which had started as a simple recording by Lisa, had sparked an online movement. People who had never met Marcus began commenting with messages of support. They called out the airline for what had happened and demanded accountability, but they also rallied behind Marcus, telling him he was not alone. The story had gone viral. News outlets picked up the story, and interviews with Marcus, Lisa, and even passengers who had been on the flight flooded television screens. It wasn't just about a boy getting kicked off a plane anymore. It was about standing up against unfairness and speaking out against injustices that people too often ignored. But Marcus wasn't thinking about any of that as he sat quietly, waiting for the next available flight. He had been through so much in such a short time that it was hard to process. Yet, in the midst of all the chaos, there was a growing sense of calm. He was going to get on another flight, and he was going to see his grandmother. At that moment, as the final details were being arranged, Marcus looked around at the faces of the people who had helped him today. Lisa, Mr. Ellis, the airline's management. Each person had done something to make sure he wasn't forgotten. They had seen something wrong and had made sure it was righted. The flight attendants who had treated him unfairly had no idea that the world was watching. What they didn't know was that sometimes, when one person stands up for what's right, it can cause a ripple effect that touches many others. And Marcus, in his quiet way, had become part of that change. Though he was still a little overwhelmed, Marcus felt a sense of pride he hadn't felt before. He had stood his ground when he was wronged. He hadn't let the injustice stand. And now things were looking brighter. He was one step closer to seeing his grandmother, and nothing would take that away from him. By the time Marcus was finally escorted to the gate for his rescheduled flight, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. It was hard to believe how much had happened in just one day. The video, the support from strangers, the reporters, and the airline's quick action. It all felt like a blur. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about the flight anymore. It was about people coming together to make sure something wrong was corrected. As Marcus walked through the terminal with Mr. Ellis beside him, he took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of thoughts in his head. He could still hear the voices of passengers who had shown their support, people who had spoken out about what they had seen. Every word of encouragement helped, but it also reminded him of how much the situation had grown beyond his initial experience. When they reached the gate, a flight attendant approached them with a warm smile. "Marcus," she said gently, "we're so glad you're back. I know this has been a stressful time for you, and I just want you to know that we're here to make sure everything goes smoothly." It was the first time he had heard such kind words from anyone working with the airline. After everything that had happened, it was a relief to hear someone speak to him like a person again, not just a problem to be dealt with. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice still a little hesitant. As they moved toward the boarding area, Marcus glanced around at the other passengers. Many of them had heard the story by now. Some smiled at him, while others seemed to recognize him from the news. It was a strange feeling, being the center of attention for something like this. He had never thought he would be in the spotlight, but here he was, about to get on a plane to see his grandmother. But it wasn't just about getting on a plane anymore. It was about something bigger. He was a part of a movement now. The support he had received wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever felt wronged. It was about standing up for fairness, even when it seemed impossible. As the final call for boarding was announced, Marcus could feel his heart race a little. He had been through so much in the last few hours, but now he could finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. The thought of finally reaching his destination and hugging his grandmother was enough to make everything feel worth it. When he stepped onto the plane, the flight attendants greeted him with smiles and kindness. It was a sharp contrast to the coldness he had experienced earlier. They showed him to his seat, and as he sat down, he let out a long sigh of relief. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Marcus couldn't help but think about the journey ahead. He had always imagined this trip to be simple, a chance to visit family, to spend time with his grandmother. But now it felt like so much more. It was about resilience, about standing up for yourself and your rights. It was about making sure that one moment of injustice didn't go unnoticed. He thought about Lisa, the woman who had posted the video, and how her small act of kindness had sparked everything. Without her, none of this would have happened. She had given him a voice when he felt like no one was listening. It made Marcus realize that sometimes one person's actions could change everything. As the plane took off into the sky, Marcus looked out the window, watching the city below shrink as the aircraft climbed higher. He was on his way to see his grandmother, just as he had planned. But now he felt like a different person. He wasn't just a boy on a trip. He was a symbol of something important, of fairness, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he felt proud. Proud of himself. Proud of the people who had stood with him. And most of all, proud to be going to see the person he loved most in the world. After hours of waiting, countless news reports, and the overwhelming support from people all over, Marcus finally reached his destination. The plane touched down, and as the seatbelt sign turned off, he felt a rush of excitement mixed with relief. His grandmother was waiting for him, and after everything that had happened, he couldn't wait to finally see her. When Marcus stepped off the plane, he could already feel the warm air of his grandmother's city. It was a small town, filled with familiar sights, stores he had visited as a child and streets lined with the same old trees. But even in this peaceful place, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed. He wasn't the same boy who had boarded the plane earlier that day. The events had transformed him somehow, and though it was hard to put into words, he felt like he was leaving behind one chapter of his life and entering another. As he walked through the airport, Marcus spotted his grandmother waiting by the gate. She was standing with a bright smile on her face, waving at him excitedly. When he finally reached her, she pulled him into a warm hug, and for the first time that day, Marcus felt like everything would be okay. "You made it," his grandmother said, her voice full of warmth. "I'm so glad to see you, sweetie." "Me too, Grandma," Marcus replied, his voice filled with emotion. As they left the airport together, Marcus couldn't help but think back to everything that had led him here. The journey had been filled with challenges, but it had also shown him something incredible: the power of standing up for what's right. The support from strangers, the quick actions of the airline, and the way people had come together to demand justice for him. It was something he would never forget. Over the next few days, Marcus spent time with his grandmother, enjoying her company and the peace of her home. He took walks in the park with her, played board games, and even helped her bake cookies in the kitchen. It was the simple, happy moments he had been looking forward to, and they gave him the chance to relax and reflect on everything that had happened. But even in these peaceful moments, the lessons he had learned stayed with him. He thought about the support he had received, the people who had taken the time to speak out and make sure his voice was heard. And he realized that he wasn't alone in his fight for fairness. There were countless others, all around the world, who were fighting the same battle, whether they knew it or not. The situation at the airport had been the beginning of something much bigger, something that would stay with him forever. Marcus had learned that sometimes standing up for yourself meant standing up for others as well. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about showing others that their voices mattered too. As the days passed, Marcus continued to feel the weight of what had happened, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a call to action. He began thinking about how he could make a difference, how he could help others who felt powerless. His experience at the airport had sparked something inside of him, a desire to stand up for fairness and justice wherever he saw it. On the final evening of his visit, Marcus and his grandmother sat on the porch, watching the sunset. The air was warm, and the quiet hum of the evening was soothing. "I'm so proud of you, Marcus," his grandmother said, her voice soft and sincere. "You're a brave boy, and I know you've got a big heart." Marcus smiled, feeling a sense of pride swell inside him. "Thanks, Grandma. I've learned that sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy, but it's worth it." She nodded, her eyes twinkling with understanding. "You're right, sweetie. And remember, no matter where you go, no matter what you face, you always have the power to make a difference. In that quiet moment, Marcus felt a deep sense of peace. He had learned so much from his experience, but most of all, he had learned that sometimes the greatest power lies in the simplest acts of kindness, fairness, and courage. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about standing up when it mattered. With his grandmother by his side, and the lessons of the past few days in his heart, Marcus knew that this chapter of his life was just the beginning of something even greater. The journey ahead might not always be easy, but he was ready for whatever came next. Marcus had been with his grandmother for a few days now, and it felt like a peaceful dream after everything that had happened. The small town was the perfect escape for him, a place to heal, reflect, and enjoy simple moments of happiness. Yet even here, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in him. The events of the past few days had opened his eyes to something greater than himself. He had learned about strength and standing up for what was right. It wasn't just about the moments where he had been wronged, but the realization that the world was full of people who cared, people who would speak out for justice, and people who would help someone when they needed it the most. The days he spent with his grandmother were a healing balm for his heart. They laughed together, shared stories, and even went on little adventures to explore nearby parks and places Marcus had never noticed before. Her laughter was always comforting, and her words of wisdom were the calm he needed to help him process everything. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sky change colors as the sun set, Marcus spoke up. "Grandma," he said, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened. It feels like it changed me in ways I don't really understand yet." His grandmother smiled softly and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes, life has a way of teaching us things we didn't expect, Marcus. But I think it's how we respond to those lessons that really matter." "I get that now," Marcus replied. "I didn't think I would ever be in the middle of something like this, but it taught me so much. I've learned that standing up for what's right can feel scary, but it's important." His grandmother nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You've always been brave, Marcus. And now you have the courage to speak up for what's fair. Not everyone has that, you know, but you do, and that's something special." Marcus felt a warmth spread through him as he looked at her. Her kind words meant the world to him, and he knew that he had learned valuable lessons from everything he had gone through. The support of strangers, the response from the airline, and the people who had stood by him had all shown him that when you believe in something, you should fight for it, even when things seem difficult. The days passed by peacefully, and as his visit was coming to an end, Marcus felt a sense of gratitude he hadn't expected. His grandmother had helped him process so much, and the peaceful setting of her home had given him the space to reflect and grow. On his last day there, his grandmother gave him a gift, something simple but meaningful. It was a small notebook, leather-bound and worn at the edges. She handed it to him with a smile. "This is for you, Marcus. Whenever you feel like you need to remember something, write it down. Write about the things you've learned and the things you still want to understand. And remember, you're never alone in this world. There are always people willing to help you along the way." Marcus accepted the gift with a grateful smile. "Thank you, Grandma. I'll write down everything I've learned, and I'll carry it with me." He looked down at the notebook, already imagining the words he would write inside. He had so much to reflect on, so much to share. As the day came to a close and Marcus prepared to leave, he couldn't help but think about how far he had come. He had arrived at his grandmother's house a little shaken, a little unsure of what had happened and what would come next. But now, after everything, he felt stronger. He had found his voice, and that was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As he said goodbye to his grandmother and headed back to the airport, Marcus felt proud of the journey he had made, not just the physical one, but the emotional one. And though he knew that life would continue to have its ups and downs, he was no longer afraid to face whatever came next. With his grandmother's words in his heart and the lessons he had learned along the way, Marcus boarded his flight home, knowing that no matter where life took him, he had the power to make a difference.